uniforms and player equipment from essentially the start of the game until 1959. And I'll talk in a minute about why I'm doing that. But so, it's actually a pretty good approach in terms of illuminating football in general, because I will talk about kind of the big picture things that happened during the game in this 90-year period. But then the uniforms and equipment were shaped by what else was happening in the game. So the other thing is that just uniforms and equipment we have lots of pictures and illustrations of those. And so most of what I will be doing today is I'll be talking while also showing images of how things changed over the course of time. So to set the stage, for some reason it is not letting me there. Okay. Let me just, sorry, I'm going to do one more. Okay. So just as an overview, the way I defined football's eras for this, how football became football, was to break it into three different eras. The first is from 1869 to 1905. That's the first football game as we recognize it until 1905. And that was a period when punting was really the core of football, with running or rushing being secondary. The middle era is 1906 to 1959. Rushing was primary, passing was secondary. We're now in the 1960 plus era where passing is primary, rushing is secondary. So there were a lot of other things going on that, to define those eras, but that's kind of the core of the game. Each of these times was a different period for football. And I'm specifically going to talk about player uniforms and equipment. I'm going to do it by talking about kind of what you see, for the most part, the jerseys and pants, the most visible part of the uniform. I'll spend a little bit of time as well talking about shoulder, thigh, and knee pads, kind of the protective side of football equipment. And then for the early era, I will talk about headgear and nose guards. That may be information most are unfamiliar with, but it's kind of fun stuff. And then for the middle era, I'll talk about helmets and face masks as well. So let's take a look at the early era. So for me, the early era, I'm going to even go back before the early era. So football derives from games that go back to the Romans and even earlier. There were all kinds of folk games where people kicked some kind of ball from one town to the next, or from this end of the field to the next. And but then, and those kind of coalesced in 19th century England with the games of soccer and rugby that split around 1850. America first adopted soccer, and what we call the first football game between Rutgers and Princeton in 1869 was really much more of a soccer match than a football game. It wasn't quite soccer as we think of it today. It had 25 players per side, and it's a little rougher than soccer, but still it was more soccer than rugby or present day football. And so Harvard, so most of the American Eastern colleges were playing soccer, but Harvard played a game similar to rugby, and they then convinced Yale to start playing that. And together, the two of those schools convinced everybody else to, when they sat down to form consistent rules so that they could play one another in games, they were able to convince the other teams to play rugby with a couple of minor modifications. So when we say football derives from rugby, early on, football was rugby, other than some minor tweaks. But then over the course of the years, the Americans made changes to the rules, and those compounded. And by the 1890s, the game had moved from a really open, kind of free-flowing rugby game to a mass momentum, smashing up the middle, flying wedges and guards back, and multiple men in motion, kind of a crazy game that was brutal. And there were lots of injuries, and there was, the newspapers kept a death watch, just counting the number of players that were killed each year. So that led to a number of problems, and so that therefore influenced some of the uniforms and equipment. So just to give you a picture of the early, before we ran into all that trouble with the brutal game, early football uniforms were really kind of a generic sportsman's outfit that people would wear for soccer, for rugby, or to go work out at the gym with dumbbells and whatnot. Very light flannel, typically in school colors. And you see a picture here of a Yale team from the 1870s. The third guy from the right is Walter Camp, who ultimately became known as the father of football. You also note that all the players have stocking caps except the guy with the ball. And the funny thing about the stocking caps is it was really mostly just for decoration. But early on in the game, when somebody punted, the men covering the punt, running down field to cover the punt, would take their hats off and swing them in the air in front of the guy trying to catch the punt to distract him. And so I guess the stocking caps did play a little bit of a role in the game, but then they quickly outlawed that practice and stocking caps disappeared from the game. Also note that no one has any pads in this picture. And I'll also just say that the early rules outlawed any hard materials on the players' bodies. No iron, no gutta percha, which was a substance similar, it was kind of like an early plastic. And that the fact that they couldn't have hard substances as part of the uniforms influenced how uniforms developed down the road. So the first place where player uniforms changed from these early sportsman's outfits were canvas vests. And if you think about a flannel jerseys, at the time, football, the rules didn't allow you couldn't tackle somebody below the waist. So you had to grab their upper body. And as a result, players were constantly trying to tackle the ball carrier by grabbing his torso, and they were constantly either they were able to grab the jersey and hold him back, or the jersey tore. So this guy named Smock from Princeton had his tailor create a canvas vest, and you see a couple of them in the picture here. These are Yale players, but they're still wearing the same style of canvas vest. And his teammates initially laughed at him for wearing the thing to practice one day, but they soon realized that he was harder to tackle with that vest, and his shirt didn't tear. So everybody thought it was a great idea, and it kind of spread like wildfire through the football community. As you see, these guys are wearing the canvas vest over some kind of team colored jersey. The guys who have the letter sweaters, those are typically the uniform from the previous year, and our habit of awarding letters to people was simply players were able to keep their uniform from the previous year that had the Y on it if they had played in the big games at the end of the year. So that's how the whole letter sweater tradition developed, came from the actual uniforms. One of the next innovations, as the game became rougher, they transitioned from just very light pants to padded pants. There's a catalog image from the 1890s from a Spalding's catalog, and you can just see these pants. They had a quilted pattern on them. It was quilted horsehair or felt. Later on, they developed kind of bamboo or reeded pads in those as well that provided some mechanical protection. The pants were moleskin or canvas, so basically a very heavy cotton fabric, got waterlogged when they got wet or when they sweat, so they became very heavy. They were baggy. They just weren't real attractive as a wearer. And here's just a quick picture of a couple of guys wearing these kinds of pants. You can again see that they're quite baggy for the wear. There's padding in places they don't really need it. There isn't enough on the shoulder or on the thighs, etc. So they're carrying extra weight they don't need, and they don't have pads in the right spots. The last point I'll make about these padded pants is to show this image, which is what's called a union suit. Obviously, there's union suit underwear that people may be aware of, but football called these union suits as well. It's the canvas vest and elastic waistband and then the pants, and he's got reeded pants, which is, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see my, so basically there's reeds on his thighs, and he's also got reeded shin guards. So this outfit that he's got on, which includes padded elbows and shoulder pads, which were just pads at the time on the shoulders, that's what everybody looked like at the turn of the century. That was the football uniform of the time. One of the things that we just assume are going to be on football uniforms today are uniform numbers, and those did not exist for the most part during the early era. But the game needed them. What was happening is football was becoming more and more popular, and so they were building larger and larger stadiums. More and more fans didn't know the individual players, and so the fans were having a hard time. They were further away, didn't know who the players were, so they just struggled to know what was going on in the game. Amos Alonzo Stagg, who was a famous football coach at the University of Chicago, he argued for numbering players during 1990, but he didn't want to do it because he thought it would be a competitive disadvantage. And that's because at the time there was a lot of shifting that went on with players. Players changed positions, to kind of trick their opponents. And he and other coaches felt that if they numbered the players, then the scouts for the opposing teams and the opposing players would see what was going on, and they'd be able to take advantage of knowing which player was which. And so unless both teams numbered the players, it was a disadvantage. So Harvard built a new stadium that opened in 1903, and their clever idea was to hand out scorecards to everybody who entered the stadium. And the example to the right is it's the scorecard from the first game ever played at Harvard Stadium. And you can see the Harvard players over on the right page, but left-hand side, they have numbers between 15 and 49, and the Dartmouth players have numbers from 50 and above. And so the players didn't actually wear numbers, but Harvard was trying to solve this problem of letting the fans know who was who on the field. So what they did was they assigned numbers to every player. They had people on the field who kind of tracked who ran the ball, who made the tackle, who punted the ball, etc. And they would signal that information up to the people on the scoreboard, and the scoreboard operators would post that information on the scoreboard so fans could then see number 54 for Dartmouth, or 64 for Dartmouth, Pratt just ran with the ball. Kind of a convoluted process, but it was the best thing that they had. And they kept doing that, well into the 1920s. So then back then, the last weekend of the football season was Thanksgiving Day. And so it turns out on Thanksgiving Day, 1905, the Drake and Iowa State played a game. And the Drake athletic director thought he knew what was going on at Harvard. He thought he understood their process, but he didn't. And so he created numbers for each of the players, and he actually put them on their backs. So they're basically, a shield or a piece of cloth with a number painted on it, pinned or sewn on to the backs of the players. And the image that I just put up is the only known image of that game that shows the numbers on the players on the field. So anyways, it just point here more than anything is that there was this need for numbers, and yet only one game throughout the entirety of the early era of football, there's only one game in which players wore numbers. Something we think of as so central to a uniform today, but it just wasn't a part of the game at the time. So again, it's a tough game, rough game, and players decide to start padding themselves, including oftentimes they're tackling with their shoulders. So they ended up using these stuffed leather or cloth pads they sewed on the outside of their sweaters or jerseys, and they padded their shoulders, their sternums, their elbows. And so you see these guys, this is the Peru State team from Nebraska, and they all pretty much have the same similar looking pads on their shoulders, really not a whole lot of other padding, but they've got these goofy lumps on their shoulders. And that was the best that they had, the best probably that money could, well, I won't say the best that money could buy. Yale had the best that money could buy. But speaking of money, guys at the lower end of the spectrum, like these boys who were high school players for a high school in Minnesota, they didn't have a lot of money. And certainly, limited budget for their football team. And so they wore whatever they could get their hands on for the games. They, most of them appear to be wearing, kind of regulation pants. Some of them have shin guards, but their jerseys are all over the place. And so, 2 points there. One is that at the lower levels of football, especially smaller colleges and high schools, a lot of times the uniforms weren't uniform. They wore whatever they could wear, and hopefully they were all a similar shade, or they were reddish or bluish or greenish, but who knows? These are black and white pictures. The other is that if you look at these guys' shoulder pads, a lot of them, they look like their mothers made the shoulder pads. They weren't made by the local harness maker. They weren't purchased from one of the emerging sporting goods companies. They were just homemade. It was the best they could do. So in addition to padding their shoulders and sternum, etc., players also began to be concerned about their heads. And early on, when they were playing more of a rugby style game, there just weren't as many collisions as there were in this, kind of beat it, run it up the gut style of football that came in the 90s. So some of the earlier players, their primary concern was cauliflower ear. And if you're not familiar with that, wrestlers get that sometimes, rugby players get it, which is the reason why wrestlers wear headgear. And it's an irritation and malformation that comes from rubbing your ears all the time against, roughly rubbing your ears. And so the football players would wrap their ears in bandages and different things to kind of protect their ears, also avoid certain kinds of abrasions. And I'll just point out that the guy in this picture is somebody that most sports fans have heard of. His name is James Naismith, who is the inventor of the game of basketball. But before he did that, while working for the YMCA, he played for the YMCA school up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and he wore this kind of headgear. So besides headgear, players used to wear their hair long during the season to provide a little bit of padding. The next move was to hire the local harness maker to kind of create, again, thinking of it as similar to wrestling headgear. This is the Lafayette team from 1894, Lafayette College. You can see the guy in the middle, kind of sitting, kneeling in the middle. He's got an object in front of him that's a headgear. And the guy far left that's sitting on the base of the steps, he's holding in his hands a headgear or a head harness. So again, just put together by the local harness maker, and it was the best thing they could come up with. Sports manufacturers started creating these things, and here's an image of one that's kind of mass manufactured. Don't know which manufacturer it was, but anyways, the game did move in that direction, but still not a lot of protection. And then finally, around the turn of the century, we started seeing what are variously called skull caps. Sometimes, the ears that hang down are called dog ears, similar to like a basset hound. And so that rounded shell at the top is the beginning of the protective helmet. So a helmet offers mechanical protection. So it's got to have some kind of harder physical barrier that keeps somebody's head from being bashed. And ultimately in football, at the time, they had a number of skull fractures. But, at the turn of the century, they weren't quite there in terms of the mechanical protection, but this was a forerunner of that kind of protection. The last piece of equipment that I'll talk about from the early era is one that probably is the strangest to modern eyes. and that is the nose guard. When I show this, I always wish that I could see the reaction of the people who are listening to this talk. But I think many of you, unless you're pretty avid football fan, there's a good chance you've never seen one of these before. So these nose guards were like much of football equipment. It was primarily worn by people who had already injured their nose. You tended not to wear it preventively. It was once you bruised it or broke it, then you'd put one of these things on. And the reason was because they, number one, they look kind of ugly, but they strapped the top of the nose guard strapped around your forehead to the back of your head. And then I'm going to show you a side view of one of these. So you can see the strap, and then down at the bottom of the nose guard is this little shelf. And the wearer clenched that shelf between his teeth. But since the whole, and so, that kept it on his face. But since the nose guard covered the nose and the mouth, clenching that shelf between your teeth made it difficult to breathe, which is not a good thing if you're playing football. So the nose guards, they used them when they had to, but nobody liked them. And the world was in search of a better solution. And oftentimes they just dropped it. And basically nose guards fell out of use in the 1910s. But it is a forerunner of the modern day face mask. So it served much the same purpose, protecting the nose, protecting the mouth, protecting the teeth. They just didn't have, a rigid enough helmet to hang something better on, and mostly just hadn't come up with the idea. So with that, I'm going to shift over to the middle era. And again, this is, with all of the injuries and the deaths that were occurring in football in the 1890s and the first part of the 1900s, there was a lot of pressure to change. Teddy Roosevelt got involved in 1905 a bit. And in the year, or in between the 1905 and 1906 season, a host of changes were proposed, a number were enacted, and a new rulemaking body emerged that ultimately, in 1910 became the NCAA. But that rulemaking body adopted a number of changes, some of which drove changes in obviously the game, but also led to changes in uniforms and equipment. But there were other things going on too. There was, players were looking for more protection. As time went on, they were also looking for lighter equipment. A number of changes that I'll talk to in a minute are all about fan friendliness. How do we make the uniforms be more fan friendly so people know what's going on when they're watching a game? And then there's other changes that are just to make the uniforms prettier. So like I did with the early era, I'm going to just show a quick slide on the middle era to say, hey, what were the big changes in football overall during the period? And so between 1906 and 1912, there are a whole host of rule changes. They put a rule in the first year, pull it out the next. But the most famous and longest lasting change was that the forward pass was legalized. So before that, there were forward passes, they just weren't legal. It was a penalty. But the forward pass was also heavily restricted. If you threw an incomplete pass, it was a turnover. The passer had to be either 5 yards right or left of the center before he threw the pass. Other times he had to be at least 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage to throw the pass. The pass couldn't be thrown 20 yards downfield, and it couldn't cross the line of scrimmage, or it couldn't cross the goal line. So there's a host of different restrictions that kept the forward pass from being more widely adopted. And part of it too is they just didn't know how to use the stupid thing. It hadn't existed, so offenses hadn't caught up. There were a host of other changes to the rules, but slowly but surely, people started using the forward pass. Pop Warner implemented his single wing offense in 1912 with a guy named Jim Thorpe, who was a heck of an athlete. Notre Dame goes to Army in 1913, beats them primarily using the forward pass. And, over time, other offenses and innovations, come out. in terms of playing style and formations, etc. But other things were happening too. The 20s saw a major stadium building boom, as well as the onset of radio broadcasts of football games. And the building boom, half of the current Power 5 football stadiums were built in the 20s. So it was a major growth period for football. The Big House in Ann Arbor was built, opened in, I think it was 27 or 28, with like 66,000 people. The 40s, probably not real substantial changes of immediate effect, but the biggest change to football in 40s was the unlimited substitution rules. That really had its greatest impact later on down the road, but it was a major turning point in football. And then the 1950s, there we basically see increased sophistication of passing offenses and defenses, especially in the NFL. They were all about bringing customers in the gate. They wanted to have a fun, engaging brand of football. So they passed and they protected their quarterback. They modified the rules to protect their quarterbacks. So now with that as kind of the background for the middle era, let me just talk about uniforms in general and how those changed. So, from my standpoint, football as we know it and understand it today really took its modern form during the middle era, and so did the uniforms. If you think about that first picture of the Yale guys in the sportsman's outfit that I showed, if you saw somebody in that outfit, you would not think he was a football player. If I showed you a picture of the guy in that Union suit, kind of the turn of the century player, people today do not recognize him as a football player. But the equipment people wore by the end of the middle era, everybody recognized that person as a football player. So the uniform and football came into modern form in the middle era. One of the things that we forget is that back through most of the middle era, most teams only had one set of uniforms. They had, if you were Michigan, you wore blue jerseys. If you were Michigan State, you wore green jerseys. Other teams wore red jerseys. We didn't have home and away. And so the picture that's on screen shows the Cornell Big Red on defense against the Colgate Red Raiders on offense. And so both teams wear red or reddish uniforms, which caused confusion for the players, but as well as the fans. And so in this game, in early 20s, Cornell actually wore something akin to what we think of as practice jerseys now, vests that slipped over their normal jersey that distinguished them from the red jerseys worn by Colgate. That never really took hold. There were a handful of other schools that did it, but it never really became prominent. But as long as it was a blue team playing a green team, everybody in the stadium could tell the difference, unless you're colorblind. It was only when Reds played Reds or Blues played Blues that it was a problem. So, but the NCAA instituted a rule in 1939 saying that the two teams had to wear contrasting colors, and they put the onus on the visiting team. Even that, so that was fine. That solved the red versus red problem. And everybody was happy until black and white television came along in the 1950s. And now, again, if you think about a blue team wearing a blue team versus a green team, if you're watching that on black and white television, you can't tell who's who. And so it was at that time in the 50s that the NFL first said, okay, the away team has to wear white. And that was really the beginning of away versus consistent wearing of white by the away team. I will note that the colleges didn't adopt that rule until somewhere in the 80s. But by that time, everybody, even at the high school level, had already adopted the practice. The rule just hadn't caught up yet. So beyond the colors of the uniform, one of the other big things we saw in the middle era was friction strips. So this is an image of a Red Grange, and you can see he's got the, most people, if you're a football fan, you've seen images like this. These guys wearing these jerseys with these stripes going and various kinds of patterns on the jerseys. he's also got this material on his arms. And so the purpose of these friction strips was to help guys like Red Grange not drop the ball. So it was intended to keep them from fumbling, but it became just a decorative piece. And teams came up with all kinds of crazy patterns in the way that they applied those to their jerseys. Shortly after that, then, I mentioned earlier how, the wool and cotton fabrics that these guys wore became very, very heavy, especially if they were wet. And, as the game started getting a little bit more into passing, they wanted more, speed became important, or even more important. And so they were looking for lighter, less absorbent materials to, for their football uniforms. And so they turned to things like airplane silk, and then later on, just before World War II, synthetics, and especially then after World War II. Those synthetics allowed vibrant colors. They could be dyed differently, and then they could be knitted differently. And so, the image that's up now is from a 1939 catalog. And so I don't know about anybody else. I think every one of those uniforms is horribly ugly. And I claim that the 1930s is the era or the decade with the ugliest uniforms in football history. But I will point out one thing from here is just look at the helmets on each of these guys. They've got some kind of color variation on the helmets, and I'll get to the reason why in a moment. So going back to uniform numbers, a bunch of things happened in the middle era. The uniform numbers, they had very limited use until the mid-1910s. Then conferences started requiring them, but some coaches just were stubborn and they still didn't want to adopt them. So we had people like H.L. Williams at Minnesota, who thumbed his nose at the Big Ten by having his players come out for the first game in 1920 wearing 4-digit numbers on the backs of their uniforms. You can see one of his players laying on the ground in the middle of the picture wearing number 2335. The conference told him not to do it again, and he didn't. But there's another coach who sent his team out wearing Roman numerals. Different people did different things to kind of mess with the system. The next big change was to have numbers on the front of the jerseys. In the early 30s, that started happening. Before that, they had only been on the back. They had the friction strips or team logos on the front of jerseys in the prior to that. But here you see a Stanford player in white, kind of a normal, almost a modern looking jersey. The team pursuing him has both friction strips and numbers on their jerseys. So that's, very much of a transition uniform. The last thing about the numbers during the middle era was the use of standardized numbers. Until 1939, any player of any position wore any number that he wanted to. Red Grange wore number 77. There was just no rhyme or reason to it, but in part to help fans understand what was going on and who played what position, they wanted to have a systematic way of numbering players. It was also then helpful for umpires who had to monitor who was an eligible receiver, etc. But it wasn't obvious initially how they were going to standardize the numbering system. One system that people came up with, if you take a look at these images, you'll see kind of a guy towards the left is it's not 87, that's B7. A guy to his right is wearing B5. Down below, there's a C1, there's an F2, etc. Few years later, this is LSU. They have the guy on the far left is E9, then T7. So N number 9, tackle number 7, guard number 6 or number 5. So they were lettering by the name of the at least offensive position. And then if you had an odd number, you were on the left-hand side of the formation. and an even number on the right side. So, kind of a crazy combination. Now kind of a crazy approach, but there's no reason why we ended up with the system we ended up with, which is centers are supposed to wear numbers starting with a 5 and guards with the 6 and tackles with the 7, etc. It could have been any number of different things. And so I'm just trying to show you that this is one of these instances where there were other things tried, they just didn't work, or they just didn't gain the popularity for whatever reason. So now I'm going to jump over to pants. One thing you'll see if you look at period photographs, this is the guy in the picture is Harry Eelson. He played for the Great Lakes Naval Training Station during World War I. His team made the Rose Bowl in 1919. And he is wearing high-waisted and high-hipped pants. If somebody wore those today, they'd be laughed at, but that was a big innovation at the time. They were, still the big baggy pants, but they wore to protect their kidneys and hips. They wore these pants, that went, darn near up to their armpits. But then when they started using the, silk and some other fabrics, they started streamlining the pants. So they were cut lower, so they didn't go as high above the waist. And they were much more, they just were tailored so that they fit better. The pants on the left, you see these little tie strings or drawstrings that you'll see those, especially in the 1920s on a lot of pants. Those were used to you could basically hold your thigh pads in place by tightening and adjusting those threads. Whereas the one on the right is getting into a space where they've got nice tight equipment and or nice tight fabrics, and boom, everything fits real well. Last thing I'm just going to say is that if you watch football today, you've probably seen some guys. It seems like the pants are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. A lot of guys have their pants well above their knees. That is not a new thing. Here's a picture of a guy who played for Oklahoma back in 1932, and their coach had the bright idea of using short shorts because it's going to be lighter, etc. So I've got a whole article on my blog about that, but if you're interested in the long history of short pants, it's out there. Shoulder pads. I'm going to buzz through this pretty quickly because I'm getting late on time, but we went from the sewn-on pads of the early to mid 1910s to these reeded kinds of shoulder pads, so kind of bamboo and reeded pads that were worn under the jersey. By 1918, we had these very simple leather and felt shoulder pads, but just a single layer of protection. By the late 20s, we had more substantial shoulder pads, starting to use some harder fiber. The pads go lower down the chest, and the one on the page 14, so the left-hand side, it's kind of cantilevering. So there's 2 layers of pads actually, and that becomes part of very common in the modern era. The last thing about shoulder pads is in the 50s they start shifting to using plastics. So again, just plastics are lighter and more protective. So boom, everybody shifted over to plastic shoulder pads quite quickly. I'm going to shift to helmets. So early helmets, we showed those earlier that were really just head gear, head harnesses. By 1918 or so, they're starting to look more helmet-like. Still the dog ears over the, covering the ears, and just the beginnings of fiber, shells to offer protection. I pointed out earlier the colored helmets that on the 1939 image that had the real splashy uniforms. And so what happened, a lot of people here in Michigan, they know the story of Michigan's, helmets came, Fritz Chrysler brought them with him from Pennsylvania, or from Princeton, but why did he have those in Princeton in the first place? And the reason is because there were some teams that started painting helmets early on, but mostly they were leather, in color. And so there were some running backs who would kind of head into piles, and they'd take their helmet off, throw it to the ground so that somebody might think it was the fumbled ball instead of and then, not try to tackle him. And so they obviously found that to be unsportsmanlike. So the NCAA said, you got to paint those straps at the top of the helmets. And then most teams also then painted the pads, or the winged pad, on the helmet as well. So that's why you had to paint them in contrasting colors, and that's why the helmets of the 30s all have those stripes on them, and that's why Michigan still wears those today. Finally, we have the plastic helmet, which shows up in 1940. The Rydell company in Chicago comes up with those with the great suspension system. And until 1960, there's an argument about whether football should use plastic helmets, which are harder, potentially cause injuries to others, but offer tremendous protection to the wearer, versus leather helmets. Ultimately, plastic wins the day. The 1948 also sees the first popular logo on helmet. It's the horns on the Rams helmet of 1948. And the last thing, which leads into the final section, is these are Purdue football players celebrating a victory. And if you look at the 4 or 5 of these guys are missing multiple teeth. So, at that point, they hadn't started wearing mouth guards, and they also didn't have the facial protection because people had stopped using those nose guards that I had talked about earlier. So how do you solve that problem? So, we have the nose guard transitions, the nose guard, which is on the right, transitions to kind of this mask. And then that mask thing transitions to an integrated part of the helmet, what we call an executioner's helmet, or an executioner's mask. And that's where we get the term face mask, because they actually were wearing masks over their faces. We then transition to the bird cage. Bird cages that protected the nose. The nice thing about these, or this was the first time that anybody who wore eyeglasses could wear their glasses on the football field. We then move to post-World War II, a whole set of clear plastic face masks. Some of them, the two on the left or the center and left, kind of cover the whole face. The one on the right actually was fairly popular in the NFL. And then we saw some others in the later 50s, kind of still masky looking things, really ugly looking face masks. And then we end up with the single bar face mask, which was kind of about as far as it went in the 50s. And then very quickly in the 60s, we went from the single bar to multi-bar to the cages that people wear today. So I'm going to just do a quick summary on kind of tell you what I told you, and then I'll open it up to questions. So just a couple of real quick hitters on the evolution of equipment. What we've seen is equipment went from homemade to manufactured by national companies. We went from new equipment being created by tinkers in their garage to the engineering and R&D departments of significant companies. We went from people using equipment therapeutically, meaning only after injury, to wearing certain kinds of equipment as to prevent injuries. We moved from natural fabrics and leathers, etc., to synthetics. And then we also see a movement from purely functional orientation to aesthetics. So helmet logos, for instance, really serve no purpose. They're just pretty and people like them. So, those are kind of the broad themes. But again, that, all of these all were, fundamental things, but they are driven by rule changes, the desire for fan friendliness, scientific advances, and this, general social trends. So a lot of reasons why it happened, but those are kind of the main themes. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to pop up my a Q&A page that just essentially just says, hey, if you're interested in learning more, I've got a website, free website. I've got all kinds of articles on there. You can follow up on specific information. If you want to track me, you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook. And then I've got just images of my 2 books. So with that.